Hello, welcome back to I Say Our Wrong Reads, and these are the books I read in February. So I had kind of a slump at the start of February that I only managed to put myself out of at the beginning of March, so I didn't actually read as many books as I usually do. But I did manage to get through a couple of quite thick ones, so I'm quite happy with my final total. So first up is Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. For those that don't know, Don Quixote is essentially a book about a nobleman that doesn't really have a lot of money who decides one day to go out and be a knight. And he just kind of dots about the countryside, fighting windmills and doing a bunch of insane things, pretending that he's a knight, and everybody's really confused around him. It's actually two books. So the first book was published in 1612 and the second book was published in 1620. I gave this one 3 stars, mainly because I liked the first half of it, the first volume of books, a lot more than I liked the second one. I thought the first one was a lot funnier, a bit nuts almost, and whereas the second one was just kind of lost the plot for me a bit going through it. I listened to an audiobook, which was probably a lot easier than reading it because it is very long. 750 pages it is, so it was a lot easier to listen to it than reading it. The first half properly made me laugh a lot of the way through it. It was really enjoyable and I would highly recommend it, but I think the difference between the first half and the second half is quite jarring, especially if you read it all in one go instead of like taking it maybe as 2 books instead, which is probably what the author intended when they wrote it 8 years apart. But fun. Next up is Timekeepers by Simon Garfield. Now this is a non-fiction book about just essentially a bunch of essays or whatever about time and how it affects our lives. When I first picked this one up, I was expecting maybe like the history of how we come to measure time to be a thing, to be what this book was about, but it actually wasn't. It was about essentially just a bunch of essays that the author wrote about his experience with time and watches and all these kind of things. So I was kind of disappointed on the whole that it wasn't really what I was expecting it to be, and it's because it is very much just a bunch of essays about the author. I ended up giving this 2 stars because of that. They weren't great, but I enjoyed a couple of them, but you know, on the whole I was quite disappointed with it. There was one section which talked about the differences between talking and beats in time and music, which was quite interesting, and how they sell watches, which was also quite interesting, but on the whole I was a bit disappointed with this one. Then, about when I was in the middle of reading that one, I got a bit bored because I wasn't really enjoying it too much, so I decided to pick up a tiny wee YA book that I have read many times before just to tide me over, and that was The Vampire Stalker by Allison van Diepen. And this is just a really short book about a fictional character that comes to life and lives in our world now, which was a lot of fun and I really enjoyed it. It's one that I've read many times before. I gave it 4 stars mainly because it's just one of those kind of campy YA books about vampires, you know, you just enjoy. I got a vampire as a villain, which I love, and a bunch of people teaming up to try and kill him, which 10 stars from me in that one. Then, after I'd finished the Timekeepers book, I decided to go for some historical fiction with the book Theif by Markus Zusak. Now, I've never read this one before. This was the first time reading it. I hadn't even seen the film, which I know quite a lot of people had by this point. But I really liked this one too. I gave it 4 stars, and I thought it was very, very well done. It made me cry towards the end. The way it was narrated was lovely, with death as the main point of view. It really played in the format quite a lot with the showing what was going to happen before it happened, but you weren't sure how it happened. So when you got to the point when it did, you were still shocked, even though you knew it was coming, because of the way it was framed and that. And there's also some absolutely gorgeous drawings in here. In particular, this one here, absolutely gorgeous, and I would highly recommend it, because it's just a beautiful story, but also it's very sad, obviously, because it's about Germany in the Second World War. But I really like the character of Liesel and Max, and just the whole environment and the picture it painted, especially towards the end. It was just absolutely heartbreaking. So that got me about halfway through the month, and in the second half of the month I started with a short story collection by Washington Irving, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Other Ghostly Tales. So this one I gave 3 stars. So I struggle a lot with shorter stories in particular, and how getting into them, and that normally makes short stories a very mixed bag for me. If I can get in the story with the first couple of pages, then I'll really enjoy it, but if I can't, then I just won't enjoy the story at all. So then you end up getting kind of a half and half. The actual story of Sleepy Hollow I found a bit, I don't know, lacking. I think it's because I both watched the Johnny Depp film and watched the TV programme, so I was expecting something a bit more than what was actually in the story, which seemed to be a little bit not very much. But there's also stories in here like the Devil and Tom Walker, which I really enjoyed. I really liked that one. And also the Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of the Enchanted Soldier, both of which I really enjoyed as well. But the other ones were kind of meh, and some of them I can't actually remember at all, which isn't a very good sign. But yep, I did like the gothic atmosphere that a lot of the stories did paint. I'm a big fan of gothic literature, and it was definitely interesting to read some of the first American gothic literature out there, even though, because I hadn't read much American gothic before. Next up was The Eternal Husband by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Now, I can't actually pronounce his name very well, so I do apologise. But Dostoyevsky wrote this one, I think, in between 2 of his most famous ones, The Idiot and Devils, and I really like this book. I gave it 4 stars, and I just, that the leash is essentially about a man who many years ago went to visit his friend and had an affair with his wife behind his back, and now he many years later lives in St. Petersburg, and this man comes back with his daughter, who's about the same age as when the man was there many years ago, and he comes back and tells him that his wife's dead and he's not quite sure what to do next. So, and it's like one of those weird exchanging books that you're not quite sure what's going on until you actually do at the very end, and then you're like, oh, what's going on? And it's him essentially trying to figure out if the guy knows that that's his daughter or not, and if he's trying to ruin him or if he's actually just trying to look for a friend. And it went to really some weird points, but on the whole I thought it was very wittily written, and it did make me laugh quite a bit, and it did make him seem like the main character was losing his mind quite a bit, until you think, oh, but is he? And it was still quite left a bit confusing, but I really liked the way it was wrapped up and brought forward into the end. So next up I read The Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. Now, Henry James also wrote The Turn of the Screw, which I think I probably would have enjoyed this more if I'd read that first, because I struggled a lot getting into the writing and I had to switch to the audiobook about, I don't know, a couple of chapters in, because it just wasn't capturing my attention and I was taking ages to get through it. So I switched to the audiobook and that somewhat helped, but at the same time I didn't really enjoy this one. I gave it 2 stars, but I know that if I read it at a different time, maybe after reading Turn of the Screw by Henry James, I probably would enjoy it a bit more. So it's essentially about this young American woman who comes with her aunt to England and then inherits a lot of money, and her family tries to control her and like tell her who to marry and that kind of stuff, but she decides not to and decides to marry who she wants, and then has to deal with the consequences of that. It is very much a character study more than there's actually plot. There is plot to it, but it's very like kind of weak with that, and more about the characters and how they interact with each other and the societal norms of their period, which for me, I thought I was definitely missing quite a few bits of this. I think it's set in the late 1800s. I think it may be set in the late 1800s, but it was published in 1908, or like this version of it was published in 1908. And yeah, so I feel like there's definitely kind of a misdivide between what actually happened and what I think happened. So I think another reread is in order of this, but I don't see me picking myself picking it up anytime soon, that's for sure. And last but not least, my final book that I read in April was the final book that I read in February, not April, was The Enchanted April by Elizabeth von Arnim. This is a book about 4 women from England who decide to go to a castle or a villa in Italy for a month, and essentially what happens when they go to a villa for a month. I really need to stop picking up books that don't have much plot in it, because clearly I'm struggling to get through them, because I didn't really enjoy this one either, and it's essentially just what happens when you lock 4 people up in a castle and then gradually add a couple of more people. So they add like a husband and a friend and that kind of thing, and it's essentially just how they interact with each other. All the plot points are when characters are brought in, so not really plot at all. It was published in 1922, but it was quite easy to read, and it wasn't too hard to understand the language, but it definitely wasn't really, it felt slow and too fast at the same time. Like, you probably weren't getting an insight, but you were getting too much at the same time, which is a bit confusing, but that's kind of how it felt. But I do really like this cover. I think it's very pretty. And yeah, that was my last one. So these were the books I read in February. I think my favourite was probably The Book Thief by Markus Zusak. Was because of just how much I enjoyed it, and especially how like emotional it made me at the time. My least favourite was probably Portrait of a Lady by Henry James, because it was too long, it's quite boring, and just wasn't my cup of tea at all. Well, thank you for joining me on my February wrap up. Thank you for all the support I got in my first video. I very much appreciate it. And if you enjoyed this one, leave a comment down below. And thank you very much for watching. Bye bye.